Hello and welcome to Understanding ASD. We are now on session 5, which will be covering employment and education. Today's session is brought to you by the Sheffield Adult Autism and Neurodevelopmental Service, and it will be presented by myself, Jonathan, who is an assistant psychologist. So regarding today's session, we will do a recap of the last session, session number 4, and then we'll move on to the main presentation, which will be looking at employment and education experiences from an autistic perspective, as well as some support you can get to help you in these institutional settings. And then we'll finish on a summary and talk about what to expect in the next session. So, recap of session number 4. So last time we looked at social interaction. So we covered things such as making and keeping friendships and the difficulties that might bring being autistic. Talked about the difficulties in sharing enjoyment, being the center of attention, and feeling that pressure to speak and interact, as well as how hard it can be coping in groups, difficulties in understanding those unspoken or inconsistent social rules, as well as finding it hard to be a part of unstructured social activities. And then we talked about the social battery. So this is a battery in which certain things, especially on the social spectrum, might drain your battery and certain things might recharge you. So for example, things like socializing, communicating, sensory stresses, any change or unpredictability might cause that battery to slowly drain and then can leave you feeling quite exhausted. So it's just important to balance that out with things that can fill your battery back up again. So you can recharge by doing certain types of socializing, for example, around a specific activity, or even spending some time by yourself. You might benefit from different forms of communication, as well as engaging in sensory activities, your interests, as well as some psychological strategies such as relaxation and mindfulness. And that brings us on to today's topic: employment, education, and autism spectrum disorder. So first of all, I'd like to know what have been your experiences of work or education and having autism. And I'd like you to take the time to consider this. So if you pause the video here and spend the next 5 minutes really thinking about your own experiences of working, being in education, and how having autism has impacted that. So let's start off with some positives. So what kind of strengths does being autistic have in a work or an education environment? So these strengths aren't true for every single person on the spectrum, but they are quite common, and it might be that you don't have every single one of these strengths, but perhaps a few of them you are really, really good at. So some examples might be, you might be really well organized, really, really loyal, reliable, You might have a really good ability to focus on a specific task that you're doing. And then also have a really good eye for detail. So you make sure that whatever task you're doing it to a really high standard. You could be really, really creative. And actually, the way that your brain works might mean that you are able to problem solve or imagine things that neurotypical people around you haven't been able to do. Autistic people sometimes are able to get a lot of expertise in particular areas, and that is especially true if you find something you're interested in. So if you are studying something or you're working in an environment that's all about one of your particular interests, then there's a good chance that you'll have absorbed and read lots and lots of knowledge on that particular interest, and therefore you'd be an absolute asset to that team. Punctuality, so trying to turn up to places on time. And integrity, I think, is a really, really important one. So let's think about your rights in an education and employment sectors. So the Equality Act, which came out in 2010, protects people from discrimination on the grounds of disability. And having autism means that you are classed as disabled under the Equality Act. And the example that they give for what is a disability is a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities. And as we know, having autism means that you're on a spectrum, so it might mean that you have quite a lot of difficulties or impairments in certain areas, and you might have a lot of strengths in different areas. But just as a bit of a blanket, you are classed as having a disability. And that's a bit controversial because there are some people that have autism who don't feel that they've got a disability and don't call themselves disabled. But just under the legal umbrella, it is termed a disability. But that's a good thing because it does mean that the Equality Act protects you in work and education from anything like discrimination on the grounds of being autistic. But it also gives you legal rights to something called reasonable adjustments. And that essentially means that your work or educational environment are able to change things to make them more accessible and easier for you. And we'll go on to that in the next slide. If you'd like to find out more information about your rights and discrimination, then you can access the government website at www.gov.uk/discrimination and your rights. So a reasonable adjustment is something that a person with disabilities can ask for from their employer or education provider if any aspects of it make it more difficult for them to do their job because of their disability than it would for someone that does not have that specific disability. So there are two main areas that this impacts. So firstly is actually the working arrangements. So maybe the hours that you're doing or the actual method of working. And the second one is a bit more physical. So it's the actual building or the place that you work. So e.g. having steps or wide doorways. And a really classic example of this is that all buildings must have wheelchair access, either in the form of a ramp or a lift under the Equality Act, because if it didn't, it would prevent wheelchair users from accessing that place of work or education. So it might be quite difficult to get your head around what is a reasonable adjustment. So let's go through an example. So if, for example, an employer is offering out a job on a temporary contract, so they're only hiring someone for, say, 3 months, and the adjustment that that company might need to put in place to make the disabled employee's life or working life a bit easier will cost quite a lot of money, or maybe will take a long time to put in place. That means it might not be reasonable for that employer to provide it, because potentially by the time that they actually get that adjustment in place, that employee might no longer be working there. However, if a person has worked for an employer for quite a long time, and say that employer is a really large organization, then the adjustment is more likely to be reasonable. So one example, especially thinking about being on the autistic spectrum, is having your own office. So if you are working in a large open plan office, it might be really, really difficult for you to get your work done because there might be quite a lot of people around, people talking on the telephone, being quite loud, and that can be really, really distracting. So there's the social element, but also the sensory element, and there's quite a lot of stuff going on, potentially quite a lot of people with a lot of noise happening. Just means that it would be a lot harder for you to do your job in an open plan office. So it might be reasonable, if you're working for a large organization that has the space, for you to work in your own office, or perhaps work in a far corner away from all the hustle and bustle of a busy office. And how can the workplace or educational institution support someone with autism? These are just some tips that might be useful for you to share with your employer if you are struggling. So you could ask your supervisor or manager to make sure that instructions that you're given are concise and specific. You can try and make sure that at work or in education you are provided with a well-structured routine, so you know what your week is going to look like, for example. You could ask them to make sure that they clarify expectations and your understanding. You could ask them to provide sensitive but direct feedback on how you're doing, and try to provide regular one-to-one feedback and reviews. It could be useful to make sure that other staff are educated on autism and other disabilities, and that will ensure that they can understand you a little bit better. As well as getting management to agree to offering clear and structured training. You could potentially ask to use a work buddy or a mentor. So especially if you're new in a job, asks for someone specific that you're able to go to and ask those questions. And also ask management to try to give you advance notice of changes. So as we know, being on the autistic spectrum means that any last minute changes or any changes in routines can be really, really difficult and anxiety provoking. So where possible, if supervisors and management are able to give you advance notices of any changes that's going to be happening in your work or education environment, and that will really help ease the anxiety. But in order for an employer to have a legal duty to put in place reasonable adjustments for you, you must tell the employer that you do have a disability, so therefore disclosing that you have autism. And if you didn't want to tell your supervisor or your manager specifically, you might be able to notify your occupational health service. And that's seen as the equivalent to notifying the actual employer or manager. But you might be wondering who you should tell. And this is a really, really individual thing, disclosing your autism, and it really depends on who you are as a person, the kind of working environment that you're in, the service, as well as the other people that you're working with, your colleagues. You might not want your entire team to know that you're autistic, and therefore you might be able to just tell your line manager or the human resources department. However, it might be that telling your entire team might make it easier for them to support you. So for example, they might be more understanding if you're having a difficult day or struggling with a particular part of the job, and therefore they might want to offer help. But there are a number of support services that can help you with work, whether you are currently in employment or if you're unemployed and looking to get into work. So the top one is a service called Spectrum E. So this is a service in Sheffield that specifically works with the autistic community, and they offer a free, personalised and person-centred in-work support to individuals who are autistic or on the autistic spectrum. So they can help someone prepare for work, they can help someone find volunteering opportunities or job placements, they can support you in finding and applying for jobs. Then once you're actually in employment, they're able to offer you in-work support and attend meetings with your manager, for example. There's also another service called Big Ambitions. And similarly to Spectrum E, they offer advice, guidance, and one-to-one support with career planning and development. And the different services that they offer include training and coaching, support with writing your CV or filling out application forms. It can also help you with interview techniques, as well as in-work support and actually offering support to an employer as well. There's also the Autism Centre, which offers support and advice to adults with ASD. They can help people find work, so paid work and work experience, and they offer specialist advice and support to clients and their employers as well. And then there's also a service called the Suit Works. So this is a free service and it's specific to unemployed men of all ages. If you get involved with this service, you're able to be given a styling session. Therefore, you can borrow a suit, a shirt and a tie, as well as shoes if you haven't got anything to wear for interviews. And then if it's also needed, they can help with interview skills to give you training sessions to essentially help you be the best you can be and prepare you for an interview. And maybe if you're not ready for employment, there are a few different other services that you can have a look at. So one is the Volunteer Centre, and this is part of a service called VAS, Voluntary Action Sheffield. So VAS are based in the city centre of Sheffield, and they can give you advice and support in helping you find a voluntary role. So you can do drop-in appointments at the service and speak to an advisor who can help you get your foot on the ladder and find you a volunteering experience. There's also the Citizens Advice Bureau or Service, also known as CAB, and these have a telephone line as well as drop-in centres where you can physically go in and see someone, depending on what you prefer. And Citizens Advice offer a really wide range of advice. So anything to do with benefits, consumer rights or discrimination, work, problems in relationships, anything to do with tax, debt management, housing and healthcare, money, law and your rights, as well as education. There's a service called Remploy, who are a specialist employment service for people specifically with disabilities. And like the other services, they can help with job hunting and doing applications, preparing for interview, but also with managing your money and building relationships at work. And then finally is the Job Centre Plus, which provide two specialist schemes to provide disability support at work. And these are called Work Choice and Access to Work. And these schemes offer support, again, for getting into work, staying in work, and accessing reasonable adjustments. So I would definitely suggest getting in touch with some of these services if you are struggling at work and need some support, if you're looking at getting into work or volunteering. And maybe if you're not ready to physically speak with another service or have an appointment, there's quite a lot of information about finding work on the National Autistic Society's website. And there is a workbook called Finding Work that you can download and have a read through to get you in the contemplation mode for potentially finding employment, if that's something that you'd like to do. And whilst we have been focusing on employment in a bit more detail, everything that we've spoken about so far can also help in an education environment. And specifically in Sheffield, there are quite a few colleges and universities that do provide support for students who are autistic. So some examples of this kind of support includes individualized packages of support, the use of assistive technology, support worker services, as well as specialist advice and guidance. So if you are in a local education institution and you're struggling, I would really encourage you to reach out to members of staff and get involved with the team that can help you get the help that you may need and offer some advice for you. And it might be quite useful to talk about bullying and harassment in an employment and education setting. So what is bullying? So bullying is really similar to harassment, and the National Autistic Society classes bullying and harassment as when one person or a group of people intentionally cause harm to someone else, and behave in a way that is deliberately offensive and unkind towards them. So for example, a bully might make jokes about an individual's disability or make rude remarks about their appearance, their sexual orientation, or anything that might seem different to them. So there's a few different types of bullying. So starting with perhaps the most obvious, which is direct bullying. So this is where you might experience rude remarks. People might be making jokes about your disability or about you being autistic. You might be receiving insults. You might have overbearing supervision or another misuse of power or their position. There might be unwelcome sexual advances. You might feel like you're being humiliated or made fun of. And you might be experiencing some kind of physical abuse. And then there's more indirect bullying, which is a bit harder to figure out. So this, for example, could be not being put forward for some training or a promotion at work. Maybe feeling like you're being persistently criticized about your work performance or the way that you do your tasks. A supervisor or manager might be setting you tasks or deadlines that you're never going to be able to do or meet. You might be left out, for example, not being invited to team social events or meetings. You might experience other people spreading rumors about you or saying things about you that aren't true to other people. As well as other people making uncalled for comments about your job security when you've been working quite satisfactorily. And bullying can occur in a number of environments. So this might be face to face, for example, in your office. This might be in emails or over written documents. It might be over the telephone. Or it might be by being unfairly monitored, singled out, or treated differently than your other colleagues with no clear rationale. But the bottom line is bullying and harassment is not okay. Your employer or educator is responsible for preventing bullying, and they should put procedures in place to prevent bullying and to give you help and support if you are feeling you're being bullied or harassed by other people. So if after today's session you think that you have been experiencing bullying or harassment at work or in your education, here are some things that you can do to try and put a stop to it. So the first one is to try to talk to someone about it. So depending on your specific situation, you might find a trusted colleague, a fellow student, or a tutor that you could discuss this with. It might be better to talk to a friend or a family member. Or you can talk to a specialist employment organisation, such as the services that we talked about earlier. It could be useful to keep a diary of what's happening. So writing things down, including dates and times, anyone else who was there to witness it, any evidence. So for example, copies of emails or written notes, as well as making a note of how it made you feel. And if you're part of a workers' union, contact your union and ask how they can support you. Or you can contact specialist harassment services. So you can contact the National Autistic Society or your local Sheffield Autistic Society. There's a service called ACAS, as well as a website called Bully Online, who can provide some information and advice on what you can do if you are struggling in a workplace or education environment due to bullying. And what should you do if your employer or educator is not supporting you? So in Sheffield, we've got a service called SOHAS, and this is the Sheffield Occupational Health Advisory Service. And this service offers a free and confidential support and advice for people whose health is affected by work, which includes having a disability and includes being autistic. And this is to try to help and support them to keep their job. So keeping you in your work environment, but making things better for you. And SOHAS advisors work in quite a lot of different GP surgeries around Sheffield, as well as having their own offices. They undergo specialist training and have experience in providing advice on a wide range of work and health issues. And if you want to get more information about them, you can visit their website at www.sohas.co.uk, or on the screen is an email and a telephone number for you to get into contact with them, talk about your situation, and get some advice. And what to do if your employer or educator still isn't supporting you and you just don't know what to do. You can contact the Citizens Advice Bureau, or CAB, who can also offer you advice and support. And they provide comprehensive free online advice pages if you'd rather read about support rather than specifically talk to someone else. And again, they've got a website, which is citizensadvicesheffield.org.uk, where you can fill out an online form, but there's also a telephone number up on the screen. So in summary, today we have been talking about employment and education. We've covered things such as your legal rights under the Equality Act of 2010, disclosing your autism, reasonable adjustments, bullying and harassment, as well as some different services you can get into contact with if you need support in employment or an education setting, and if you need support with bullying and harassment. So thank you for joining me again today in our 5th session. And the next session will be our last. So it'll be session number 6, and it'll be around recognizing your strengths as an autistic individual. So I hope to see you next time. Thank you. Goodbye.